Good afternoon. Welcome to the discussion on chairing the G20, Economic Steering Committee for the World. I have with us two senior policy leaders, heads of think tanks, to discuss the issues related to the G20. Dr. Fahad Al-Turki has chaired the policy research process for Saudi Arabia's G20 presidency in 2020, and Mr. Paolo Magri, currently chairing the policy research process for Italy's G20 presidency in 2021. They're officially both leading. Mr. Fahad Al-Turki has led the T20 process, as it is officially known, and Paolo Magri is leading the T20 process for the G20 this year in 2021. I welcome you, Fahad and Paolo. Fahad, Paolo, what I would like to discuss is G20 in a slightly broader framework. We have only 30 minutes, but we have 3 or 4 questions that I'd like to pose to you. Does G20 still remain the most important economic multilateral? Is it the most effective economic multilateral? What lessons can we learn on global economic governance from G20 and past G20 presidencies? What issues should we prioritize looking forward? How can G20 develop a multi-year framework for global economic recovery, especially because 1 year is really too short to envision, put a roadmap, and also implement? How can G20 be made more effective? Can we do anything to make it more representative as a multilateral forum? So what I'd like to do is I'll start with the main question that I'll pose to both of you. Does G20 remain the most important economic multilateral? And is it the most effective economic multilateral for the situation we have in the world today? So Paolo, first you.
It is. Thank you, Ashi. Thank you for this invitation at a very timely moment. It is a very important multilateral exercise, not because it is the most effective, we will discuss this in this conversation, but because there is not much else around. So we have to look and care it with a lot of attention, because there are no many alternatives around to represent the world and to give the world in an inclusive way some voice.
And Fahad, what do you think?
I agree with Paolo's assessment on the importance of the G20, but may not be the effectiveness of the G20. Of course, the G20 have increasingly important global platform, especially on the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic and its aftermath. The pandemic, which was started last year under the Saudi presidency, was the cause of the cancellation of many events that were helping global leaders as well as global organizations to get together, discuss and cooperate on important issues related to the global economy and societies and climate. Some of them are held virtually, less effective. Some of them are being cancelled. So, for example, Climate COP25 and Biodiversity COP15 were both cancelled. So if we look at the history of the G20, it was created in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. That where the group was important and to a certain degree more effective than what we see now. There is a need to overcome some of the shortcomings of the G20, in particular the enforcement of some of the major recommendations. But also the continuity, and I think we will talk more about this. To overcome many of the issues related to the G20 must be agile in face of either change in government or COVID-19 or what have you. It has to be inclusive and transparent and ensure continuity of the agenda from one presidency to another. And I'm glad to see now the huge synergy between the Saudi G20 presidency and the Italian G20 presidency. If we recall, Saudi main pillars was empowering people, safeguarding the planet, shaping new frontiers. If we look at the Italians' main 3 pillars, we'll see people, planet, and prosperity. So I'm happy with the continuity process, and it remains to be seen whether we are effective or not. The G20 must look forward to policy solutions, but also assess policy recommendations and whether the countries are implemented these policies or not.
Paolo, you are part of the presidency, the Italian G20 presidency, which has taken on leadership for this calendar year. Can you tell us a little bit about the priorities under People, Planet and Prosperity? What are some of the issues that you are prioritizing? What should be the issues that we should prioritize this year?
Yeah, I think prioritize is the key word. But as I answer to your question, let me start with another question. What do we remember best about past G20 summits? The answer is quite easy. The collective response of the biggest economies in the world to the worst economic crisis in decades. But I'm afraid I'm not referring to 2020. That response took place in 2009, $6 trillion. Last year, global recession was even worse than in 2009. So why don't we remember collective action at the G20 level in 2020? After all, the need was clearly there. And not only the need was there, but the response was also there. A $12 trillion stimulus, double that of 2009. But the stimulus was coming from single countries or blocks rather than from a multilateral consensus. So the need was there, the response was there, but something was missing, the will to work at the multilateral level. And today division among countries, and especially among big powers, run deeper than in 2009. And in a divided world, what multilateral fora can achieve is uncertain. What is sure, however, is that in 2021, the need for multilateral responses has not gone away. It is actually only growing wider. Poverty, stimulus, suspicion among countries about unfair competition, and these, you asked me about the priority, these are the issues that this year G20 should prioritize in the economic field, and possibly pair them with long-term economic challenges such as climate change and digital transformation. Something along this line has been done last year, let's be clear, especially on poverty and debt, with the launch of the G20 Debt Service Initiative. It's a first step in the right direction, and we as think tanks are called to make other proposals that policymakers can take seriously. Ashay, if we want the G20 to go back being the proper forum for negotiating and agreeing on global economic challenges, we have to do this. Hopefully, this will help us avoid another black swan after the coronavirus, a new global financial crisis, wherever it comes from.
Paolo, let me stay with you and ask you a follow-up question. You spoke about the global financial crisis of 2009 and how G20 came together and what we remembered. This also brings me, is connected to the question I was going to ask. One of the things that worked really well at that time was a multi-year framework, because at that time the G20 meetings actually were being held twice in a year. So as we went from Pittsburgh to London to Canada, there were multiple meetings, and they seem to have a multi-year framework, a multi-presidency framework in place. Can we do something now? Can we put Fahad talked about continuity. Is there continuity? Can we put a multi-year framework so that we can make sure that from 2020 to 2021 and beyond 2022 and 2023 that we can actually implement the collective response that is required?
As Fahad mentioned, continuity is clearly crucial because we are discussing and suggesting issues and topics which go well beyond the 1 year for sure, the 2, the 3, the 4, and the 5 years. So how do we work on that? Legacy and continuity are already in a way achieved thanks to the Troika, the group of the previous, current and next presidencies. And this all true in particular when it comes to as I mentioned, to long-term challenges and trends, from the sustainability of mounting debts worldwide, to the implementation of new climate targets and policy, to the search of global governance for the cyberspace. To this aim, the think tank community holds an important responsibility. In particularly, the Think 20 should make concrete proposal to streamline and prioritize topics, as I said. We can, with the Troika, in a long-term plan, certainly shine a light on a wide range of topics, which may require further reflection over the next year. But we also need to select those that are best dealt at the G20 level. And let me name just a few. Universal access to vaccine by strengthening COVAX platform, better coordination of recovery packages, and debt relief. And in my view, this will be our most important contribution this year. Looking at next year and the year after that, looking at proposals that are actionable and feasible even in today's divided world, so that the global economic recovery is swift and equitable as possible. Hopefully, Indonesia will take up from where we have left, as we did with Saudi Arabia, and India will follow in its footsteps.
Fahad, same question to you. You were leading the process in 2020, because of which you had a window of studying closely what happened in 2019 when you took over, and because you've handed over to the Italian presidency now. Do you think an effective multi-year framework is possible? Did it work well in 2020, or was 2020 too much of a surprise with COVID that we had to rewrite?
I think to your last point, definitely with COVID it was a surprise. I think I'll answer in two folds. One is on the continuity phase. I think the Troika plays a very important role on the continuity process. Countries should put a priority on global issues above and beyond national interests, and I think that is important. But we're talking about the Troika. It is effective at the G20 at the sovereign level, but it's not very effective at the engagement groups. It remains weak, and it risks drawback or setback for the continuity of the engagement groups. And if you think about the G20 itself, the G20 is a club of the largest 19 economies. And so many other economies or countries are being excluded. And the only mechanism for them to participate in the dialogue, framing the agenda, as well as casting their policy recommendations that can be considered by the leader of the G20 is through the engagement groups. So it's very important that the engagement groups, the Troika at the engagement group level, given more attention and strengthened. For example, now the Troika for the T20 is Saudi Arabia, Italy, and Indonesia, but Indonesia hasn't identified the leading or the chair of the T20. So we might, depending on the timing of the choice of selecting the Troika or the chair of the Indonesia, there might be a risk on the continuity. And in terms of the priority, I think we definitely, first and foremost, the priority should be addressing COVID-19 pandemic and its aftermath. But hopefully, as many of us would like to believe, this is going to be a short time lived impact. So it has a long-term implications, but addressing the recovery and so on, this will be addressed within 2 or 3 years. The G20 should not lose sight of the long-term implications of issues related to, for example, climate. This is an issue that is close to our heart, and it was one of the top priorities for Saudi Arabia. Saudi has proposed the circular carbon economy as a holistic, integrated, inclusive, and pragmatic approach to manage emission while taking into consideration different countries' circumstances. And this should also continue in the process. So we put our priorities for short term, but we do not lose sight of long-term challenges.
Can I add, Asher, can I add a word?
Go ahead, please.
Since my friend Fahad correctly mentioned the challenges to continuity, let me add to you, to India, which will step in soon, and to our friend from Indonesia, should they be listening, other challenges, which are not impossible to address, but we have to be aware and acknowledge them. There is a huge work of coordination involved in this activity, because on it's vertical and horizontal in coordination. Vertical, as we are discussing, because we need to secure continuity, which means work with the one who were before you and the one who will be after you, and this is not only easy, as Fahad said, but there is also a huge horizontal coordination task, which means different task force address different topics, but most of them are overlapping, of course. And so you need to make them communicate. And then different engagement groups, all of them address the same issue. But if there is no dialogue and coordination and in sending strong messages, it's very confusing. So 10 task force, several engagement groups, the predecessor and the future chair, it's a lot of coordination, and we have to be careful that coordination sometimes takes a lot of time and you miss the point of the result and the priority.
Paolo, Fahad, let me come a little bit to the content. The session is titled Economic Steering Committee for the World, and is G20's aim now to remain the Economic Steering Committee? Should it limit its scope and not take up issues like the climate issues, which are already being discussed at the UNFCCC, or maybe trade issues which are at the WTO? Or do you think there's a way in which G20 can galvanize and make some progress where progress is otherwise not happening with some of the multilateral institutions? So we have a choice, I suppose, whether G20 should narrowly focus on some of the financial matters, as it did 10 years ago. Maybe it was effective because of that. Or the scope has increased legitimately, probably, and it should include climate, sustainability, maybe issues which are already being discussed by the World Bank and WTO. So what do you think? How can we manage this scope? What are some of the guiding principles to manage this scope of work that the G20 has? So maybe Fahad, first to you, and then I'll come to Paolo.
Beautiful question. Thank you, Akshay. Very thoughtful and deep question, I guess. I wouldn't call the G20 the steering committee of the world economy. I would call them the advisory committee, because their recommendations are not enforceable. But in terms of scope, I guess it should be all of the above. I think the issues of climate and long-term challenges to the global economy, to the globe, to the planet, I think poses a very high risk, if not addressed by the largest 19 economies in their gathering, then who should be looking at these issues. And in cooperation and collaboration with other international organizations, providing them with the policy recommendations. And if you look at why it should be all of the above, because of the structure of the G20 that is missing in the structure of the international organizations. So, for example, the existence of the engagement groups, the T20, the B20, the C20, and the rest, is an important element and should be incorporated effectively within the G20 framework on both, on the agenda discussion, on opening the door for the recommendations, continuous dialogue between the policymakers at the sovereign level of the G20, as well as the engagement groups, as well as on the continuity. And that's where I emphasize the role of the Troika, not only at the sovereign level, but also at the engagement groups. I think one of the main issues that was recommended under the G20 Saudi Arabia presidency was the circular carbon economy, which builds on the circular economy concept to tackle issues related to energy, gas house emissions, and so on. This was initiated by the engagement groups, and it was raised in recommendations to the ministers of energies who endorsed it, and then at the end of the process, it was also endorsed by the leaders of the G20 countries. So this is just an example to show you the importance, not only on the sovereign level, which they also participate in the international organization, but also the engagement part of the T20 of the G20.
Good point, Fahad. I keep forgetting to remind. I think you made a good point earlier that while G20 may be defined on a government participation for 19 plus EU, possibly with some other special invitees, but the engagement groups like the Business 20, the Think 20 for think tanks and academic institutions, the civil for some of the non-profits, these are more open, more representative, more inclusive in that respect, and probably also free. There's a free invitation for whoever wants to participate, given the guiding principles that you set. That's true. Paolo, last word to you on what you think on how we can manage the scope, and probably you can end a little bit with Italian priorities for this year for our audience.
Let me start with the Italian priority. The Italian priority, my role is prioritize on priority, if I can use this. And so in saying this, I'm replying to your previous question also. There is a strong debate on inclusiveness. And inclusiveness, which is, of course, a very good word. Who is against including? Who is in favor of excluding? But we have to be very careful because inclusiveness in topics and in participants sometimes is at odds with effectiveness. If we are very inclusive in topics, widening them, and addressing also topics which have other fora to work on, it may not be the best solution. I'm not taking the example of climate change, because I believe the more we talk on climate change, the better. The more pressure we put on that is good. But it's clear in your question, and I agree, there are other multilateral fora which are working on that. So this is not a priority for action for the G20. It's a topic to put pressure on. Also, and the effort is to make a choice between topics which are relevant for discussion, to frame the future, to raise issues that will be for action in 5 or 6 or 7 years, and topics on which we should try to push to get action now. And I made a few examples before. The same applies to inclusiveness of participants. This issue has been raised several times. It's good, of course, to get everybody on board, but we have to keep in mind that we have other fora in which everybody is on board, the UN, and these fora sometimes are not the most effective or for action. So I think we have to implement a good blend between inclusiveness and effectiveness. Having said that, I strongly defend the G20 as one of the most inclusive exercise that we have created in the last years, meaning that it goes beyond the G7, which is something of the past, and it's tried, compared with the UN, to give some more effectiveness, at least in the past. So I think it is important to keep in mind all these issues.
Well, you've given us a lot to think about, and I'm very taken by two. I suppose you made two. You gave us two formulations or two maxims that pretty much summed up, I think, your roles, your respective roles. I think, Fahad, looking back, perhaps your correction is appropriate, calling it the advisory committee for the world, and looking forward, I think, Paolo, your maxim that you have given, as in your role, which is prioritizing the priorities, I think is appropriate. And so I hope Paolo, you succeed in prioritizing the priorities, because for those who are coming after you, like Indonesia and India, I think it will be very helpful. So with that, all I have left to do here is thank you for accepting the invitation to join Colaba Conversation. I hope you will join us again next year and the other forums that ORF is going to hold on the G20 through this year. And I hope that we will get a chance to meet in person as COVID recedes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.